My name is Isabel Grant. I'm 28 years old, and for the past 3 years, I've been living a double life. On the outside to my family, I was a disappointment, a wanderer, a dropout, someone who had squandered a privileged upbringing. But behind closed doors, I was quietly building something that would one day change the financial industry. I just hadn't told them yet. The Grant family isn't just any family. We are an institution. For 4 generations, Grant & Co. Securities has stood like a monument to traditional American finance, rooted in East Coast money private schools, tailored suits, and unwavering rituals. Our estate in Fairfield County, Connecticut, could be mistaken for a small museum, high ceilings, oil portraits of ancestors, and a grand piano no one had touched since the Reagan administration. Every summer, we gather there for the Grant family dinner, a showcase of promotions, milestones, acquisitions, and awards. Success is measured in corner offices, not code repositories. Power is still found in leather briefcases, not digital dashboards. I arrived late that evening, driving my modest electric sedan past the iron gates and manicured lawns. The sun was just setting behind the estate's spired rooftop, casting long shadows across the gravel driveway. As I stepped out of the car, I could already hear the hum of conversation and crystal glasses clinking from the east wing. Inside, the family had assembled in the drawing room, exactly as I remembered my father. Charles Grant, CEO of the family firm, stood near the fireplace with his usual tumbler of scotch. My mother Diane orchestrated the seating arrangement with military precision. My cousin Eleanor, of course, was mid-story about her recent client win in Dubai. And then there was Aunt Caroline. The moment I stepped into the room, her voice sliced through the hum like a finely sharpened knife. Unemployed again, she asked, not even bothering to mask her grin. Or are we still between projects? Her eyebrows lifted with faux concern, but the glint in her eye was unmistakable. My stomach twisted, but I managed a smile. Nice to see you too, Aunt Caroline. The room fell quiet for just a moment, the way it always does when a jab hits too close. My father cleared his throat. How was traffic from the city, he asked, deflecting. Not bad, I said, settling into the chair assigned to me between my grandmother, Victoria, and of course, Eleanor. Dinner began soon after. Silverware clinked against china, and the courses arrived in choreographed waves. I listened as my relatives discussed market trends, board appointments, and expansion into Southeast Asia. Every now and then, someone would glance my way, waiting for me to contribute something of value, anything that could justify my presence. It had always been this way. I was the Grant who broke pattern. While Eleanor interned at the firm in high school, I was tinkering with Raspberry Pis and building apps no one in the family understood. While my father praised her for securing million-dollar accounts, he often looked at me with a puzzled frown, unsure what to make of my digital pursuits. My mother once told me after one of my early coding competitions, "Darling, this is adorable, but tech is a phase right. Real success comes from institutions." So I stayed silent. I became good at smiling at playing the part of the well-behaved disappointment. But under the surface, I was studying, building, failing, learning, crafting something they couldn't see coming. As dessert was cleared, the conversation steered inevitably back to careers. Eleanor just closed a $25 million deal, Uncle Henry beamed. Her 4th this year, truly remarkable. Eleanor feigned modesty. We're just doing our part to carry the Grant legacy. Then Caroline turned to me again, her voice dipped in sugar, but sharp as glass. And what about you, Isabel, still pursuing your, what was it again, cryptocurrency freelance consulting? I took a breath. Technology consulting, yes. Building solutions for financial infrastructure. Oh, how fascinating, she said. Still not profitable, though, I presume. Before I could answer, Grandmother Victoria set her fork down and adjusted her pearl necklace. Isabel has always had potential. She just needs to find the right application for it, something that fits our values. There it was again. The unspoken rule in this family: your worth is defined by how well you reflect the legacy. But things were about to change. They had no idea that in less than 24 hours, the cover of Fortune magazine would hit newsstands across the country. And on that cover would be my face, not as Isabel the disappointment, but as Isabel Grant, the founder of Safelink, the AI fintech company, already securing billions in transactions. They didn't know that the man my father considered his mentor, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, had addressed me as Mom during our last board meeting. They thought I was nothing. And I had let them. Until now. I didn't attend a single Grant family function that first year at Stanford. Every email from home felt like a gentle but pointed reminder of the role I was supposed to play, and every call ended with some version of, "When you're ready to come home, the firm is waiting." I kept them at arm's length, replying with pleasantries, sending photos of campus trees and coffee shops, but never the code, never the people, never the classes that made my heart race. I knew they wouldn't understand what it meant to stay up until 3 a.m., debugging a line that refused to cooperate, or the high of watching your program finally run clean and fast. They wouldn't see beauty in that. But not everyone dismissed me. Professor Evelyn Hayes, my mentor and guide in a world that finally made sense, once told me legacy is only noble if it evolves. Otherwise, it's just a trap dressed up in gold leaf. She said that during office hours one afternoon, while reviewing a pattern recognition script I'd written for a class project, she had this way of seeing through you, cutting through the performance, the polish, the pedigree, and finding the raw ambition underneath. She didn't care that I came from old money. She cared that I asked the right questions, the ones that started with "what if" and ended with a sleepless weekend. By junior year, I was interning at a fintech lab off campus, designing back-end tools to streamline compliance verification. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and I loved it. The team was messy, brilliant, diverse in every way my family was not. There were no mahogany desks, no engraved nameplates, no decades-old bloodlines. But we built things that worked, that solved actual problems, and that made banks take notice. For the first time, I felt a kind of power that wasn't borrowed or inherited, it was earned. Still, every time I returned home for holidays, I wore a mask. I toned down my excitement, tucked away my passion. I had learned how to make my victories small enough to fit their mold. I stopped trying to explain what an API was, or why blockchain mattered beyond crypto. I smiled when they called what I did interesting or experimental, even though what I was building would one day protect their very assets. I shrunk myself to fit the narrative they needed me to play, and with every compromise, a part of me hardened. The truth is, legacy isn't just a family name. It's a set of expectations that wrap around you like ivy pretty from the outside, but strangling your ability to grow in a new direction. I began to resent not just the name Grant, but the way it had been weaponized against me in dinner table conversations, where my achievements were footnotes in boardrooms where I was the invisible daughter. In every moment I felt like a guest in my own life. They didn't see me. They saw the vacancy I left behind when I refused to follow the plan. One night, in a moment of frustration, I remember telling Marcus, my closest friend and future co-founder, I feel like I was born in a museum, and all I want to do is build a rocket. He laughed, not because it was funny, but because he understood exactly what I meant. He'd grown up on the edge of opportunity, always pushing to be heard in rooms that didn't expect him to be there. We were both anomalies, me, the runaway heiress of Wall Street. Him, the self-made genius from nowhere. Together, we started sketching the outlines of something bigger. It started not with ambition, but with a need financial security that adapted as fast as threats did. Banks were still using systems written decades ago, vulnerable to attacks they barely understood. What if we could build a layer of AI that could monitor transactions, in real time recognize anomalies, flag fraud, before it even finished executing. What if legacy didn't have to mean fragile, but could mean fortified? We called it Safelink. And though it began as a side project, something to scratch the itch of possibility, it would soon become the blueprint for everything I wanted my legacy to be, not inherited, not assumed, but engineered, with purpose, with edge, with clarity. And still, no one in my family knew. Because at the time, their version of success didn't include people like me. Not yet. It hadn't always been this hidden. There was a time long before Stanford and Safelink when I used to share everything, my little programs, my ideas, my tiny triumphs. I was 11 when I built my first game from scratch, a simple puzzle app I designed during winter break while my cousins were skiing in Aspen. I was so proud of it, I remember gathering the family around the living room TV, plugging my laptop into the screen, and demoing the basic interface. The room was politely amused. A few nods, a chuckle or two. And then Aunt Caroline had said the words that still echo in my bones. What a nice little hobby. But remember, Isabel, real success means real results. Focus on your studies. You don't want to fall behind Ellie. Ellie, my cousin Eleanor, she was everything the Grants could ever ask for in a successor, confident, eloquent, socially magnetic. Where I was awkward, she sparkled. Where I preferred silence, she commanded attention. She gave speeches at galas by the time she was 16, interned with the firm's London office at 17, and had her first published article on global market strategies in Forbes before 20. Every Thanksgiving, she got her own toast. Every family dinner, she was the first name on everyone's lips. I stopped bringing up my coding projects around that time. It didn't feel like there was room for both of us. I remember the science fair in 8th grade, where I built a home energy consumption tracker using a recycled Arduino kit. I won first prize beating out the son of a local tech executive who had 3 tutors and a team of sponsors. I came home glowing, the ribbon still pinned to my hoodie. My father smiled briefly, then glanced over my shoulder at the mail stack. "Very good, sweetheart," he said absently. "But don't let this distract you. You'll want to start preparing for your economics placement exams next semester." That night, I tucked the ribbon into the back of a drawer. It's probably still there, somewhere between outdated USB drives and childhood journals. The pattern continued. No matter how hard I tried to shine, it always felt like my light had to be dimmed to keep others comfortable. Ellie was never malicious, at least not openly. But her accomplishments were always front and centre, reinforced by every uncle, every aunt, every nod of approval at family events. Once, during a Christmas party, I overheard Uncle Henry telling a client, "Ellie will run the firm someday, mark my words." Isabel, "Oh, she's more of a creative spirit, a free thinker, smart girl, but not quite in the family mould." It was said with a smile, a drink in hand, but it landed like a knife. Eventually I stopped sharing, not because I wasn't proud, but because it hurt more to be dismissed than to be invisible. I learned to mask my passion behind vague answers, just a side project helping a friend with an app, a little freelance work. Each deflection was armour, each silence a kind of survival. I didn't want to be pitied. I didn't want the forced encouragements, or worse, the indulgent laughs that came with being underestimated. But the thing about brilliance, real brilliance, is that it doesn't disappear just because it's ignored. It waits. It builds in quiet corners. It grows stronger in the dark. In high school, I stopped asking for coding books for Christmas. I used babysitting money to buy them myself. I downloaded free PDFs and stayed up until 2 a.m, following GitHub threads and online tutorials. When my cousins were attending pre-college finance camps, I was building encryption algorithms and running beta tests with online users in Europe. They called me quiet, distracted, introverted. The truth was, I was busy creating a world where their approval wouldn't matter. I knew I couldn't outshine Ellie in the spotlight they designed for her. so I stopped chasing it. I built my own light instead. It wasn't loud, it wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. And one day it would be undeniable. One day they wouldn't be able to look away. One day they would realize the girl who disappeared into her laptop wasn't playing games. She was laying foundations, building an empire. But for now, I kept my brilliance shadowed, hidden behind a smile, tucked beneath polite small talk and strategically vague answers. Not because I doubted its worth, but because I knew deep down that the longer they ignored me, the more powerful the reveal would become. And yet, even knowing that didn't make it easier to live in the shadow of someone else's narrative. By senior year of high school, I was surviving, not thriving, performing just enough to avoid confrontation, hiding my real victories behind practiced indifference. My dreams had become contraband, stored in password-protected folders, and coded messages to myself. It was around then that I discovered Stanford. To my family, Stanford was acceptable. Not ideal, certainly not Ivy League, but tolerable. A respectable, second-tier option for the West Coast crowd, Uncle Henry once remarked. What they didn't realise was that Stanford wasn't just a university to me, it was my escape velocity. A chance to break free from the gravitational pull of the Grant legacy without completely severing the tether. It was far enough from Connecticut to feel like exile, but prestigious enough that my parents couldn't object without sounding petty. They assumed, of course, that I would study economics or business. My father made a point of printing out the list of Stanford's top MBA feeder programs and leaving it on my nightstand one morning during winter break. He wrote on the post-it, "A few interesting tracks for your future." I smiled, thanked him, and quietly recycled the entire packet. I chose computer science. I didn't tell anyone until after my first quarter was complete. By then, I'd already written 2 machine learning models for data pattern recognition and joined a student-run startup that was trying to develop fintech tools for underserved communities. It felt like my lungs were expanding for the first time in years. My parents' reaction was predictably dismayed. "What exactly do you plan to do with that degree?" my mother asked during our Christmas video call. "Build things," I said simply. "Like apps." She frowned as if the word itself were an insult. "No," I said, "like systems. Infrastructure. Solutions people actually need." There was a pause on the line, a silence so familiar it felt like a chorus. Then my father spoke calm and clipped. "Well, let's hope you pivot back to something more sustainable before graduation. You don't want to close too many doors." What he meant was, you're walking away from the door we opened for you, the one we expect you to walk through. But Stanford opened different doors, ones my family would never have chosen, but ones that led to air I could actually breathe. It was during my sophomore year that I first met Dr. Evelyn Hayes. She was a visiting lecturer then known more for her patents in real-time fraud detection algorithms than for her classroom presence. Her lectures were like puzzles, nested inside stories laced with sharp humour and brutal honesty. Most students were intimidated. I was electrified. One afternoon, after a particularly dense lecture on predictive modelling in financial systems, I stayed behind to ask about a data structure she had only briefly mentioned. I was nervous, fumbling with my notebook, trying to phrase the question without sounding naive. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she watched me for a moment, really watched me. "You think in branches, not lines," she said. "That's rare. Most students memorize. You map." It was the first time anyone had ever described how my brain worked with admiration rather than confusion. That single sentence became a thread I pulled on for years. Evelyn became my mentor, though she never used the word. She invited me to lab meetings, connected me with alumni, forwarded me articles with subject lines like, "You destroy this?" or "This smells like your kind of problem." She didn't flatter, and she never softened the truth. When something I built broke, she made me own it. When I succeeded, she barely blinked, but she respected my mind. And in her world, that was currency. One day, over lunch, on the steps outside the engineering quad, she said something I'll never forget. In your world, your name is your burden. In mine, your ideas are your worth. If you're smart, Isabel, you'll learn how to stop carrying one and start building with the other. I didn't respond at the time. I just stared down at my salad and nodded. But her words cut through me like acid, burning away the layers of shame I had worn like skin. I wasn't trying to escape my family. I was trying to become something they'd never thought possible. Not a deviation. Not a disappointment. But a new definition. The more I learned, the clearer it became. I wasn't running from the Grant legacy. I was preparing to rebuild it, on my terms, with new tools, in a new language. And the best part, they had no idea. Not yet. The crash hadn't destroyed me. It had stripped away the illusion that I could succeed quietly. If I wanted to build something real, something that mattered, I would have to risk being seen and being underestimated. Again, what no one tells you about failure is how it echoes. Not just in your inbox or your bank account, but in the small moments, the twitch of hesitation, before speaking, in meetings, the impulse to downplay your ideas, the quiet panic when someone asks, "So what do you do?" and you no longer know how to answer without lying or apologizing. After Pierpoint folded, I felt like I'd lost the right to claim ambition. I was no longer the promising prodigy from Stanford. I was the girl who tried and failed. The cautionary tale, the one who should have known better. Investors stopped responding. Some politely, some not at all. Classmates I once mentored began avoiding eye contact. Evelyn Hayes, though kind, offered no false comfort. Some ideas break, she told me flatly. Some ideas break you. The job is figuring out which one happened. I didn't know how to answer her, not yet. So I filled the silence with motion. I took contract gigs, bug-fixing low-level security patches, anything that paid enough to keep me from going home. I coded in cafes until they closed. I stayed logged into Slack channels for projects I was no longer part of, hoping someone might message me back in. But no one did. At home, I stopped answering calls. My mother left a dozen voicemails checking in. "We can help you. Reset your cousin Eleanor. Just got her promotion. Maybe you two could talk," but I couldn't bear the sound of her voice. Even love, when threaded with pity, can feel suffocating. I kept the blinds closed. I stopped wearing shoes. I started tracking the days not by calendars, but by the number of ramen packets left in my cabinet. And yet, the notebook stayed open. I still wrote things down. A line of code that came to me in a dream. A diagram for a better identity verification protocol. Thoughts about how financial institutions still relied on outdated architecture to secure trillion-dollar transactions. I was too hurt to build, but too stubborn to let the idea die. The final push came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. Rain hammered against the windows, and I hadn't slept in almost 40 hours. I was sitting on the floor, wrapped in a sweatshirt, 3 sizes too big, staring at the safe my grandfather once gave me, as a birthday gift, a miniature replica of the real one in the Grant Estate Library. And suddenly it struck me. In a world built on digital trust, legacy systems were analog vaults in an age of cyber assault. Banks weren't just old, they were exposed. Not because they were careless, but because they were confident. They believed their age gave them immunity. I knew better. I saw the system from both sides. I understood the language of finance because I'd grown up at its altar. I understood the mechanics of code because I'd lived inside it. And maybe that intersection was where I would find my redemption. That night, I opened a new file on my laptop and wrote one word: Safelink. I didn't know what it would become yet. I didn't know who would build it with me or if anyone would believe in it. But for the first time in months, I had a direction again. Not a plan, not a pitch deck, just the faint glow of something that felt like hope. And this time, I wouldn't be quiet about it forever. Failure had taught me something the Grant family never could, that worth isn't inherited, it's forged. And sometimes the crash is not the end of the story, it's just the sound of gravity breaking, a prelude to liftoff. The night I wrote Safelink in that empty text file, I wasn't thinking about legacy or redemption. I was just trying to breathe again, to remember what it felt like to be in motion. I didn't have a company or a team or a single line of code, but I had a question, a single question that pierced through the fog. What if financial systems could protect themselves in real time? That was the seed. Everything else grew from it. I spent the next 72 hours sketching, no sleep, just caffeine, adrenaline, and a fury I hadn't realised I'd been carrying since Pierpoint collapsed. I mapped out protocols, envisioned data flow, imagined how a neural net could adapt to threats before they even formed. The more I wrote, the clearer it became this wasn't just about security. It was about building a system that could evolve a living defense instead of a static shield. But I couldn't do it alone. The first person I called was Marcus Lin. He had been my co-conspirator since freshman year, a cybersecurity savant with a mile-long resume and a past that made investors skittish. He answered on the second ring, groggy, but curious. I'm in, he said before I'd even finished the pitch. But we're gonna need more firepower. Next came Maria, AIM. She dropped out of high school at 17 and still out-coded most CS grads by 21. I met her at a hackathon where she'd built a decentralized auction platform in 12 hours on no sleep and 2 granola bars. She didn't ask many questions. Just replied, send specs. The last to join was Devon, a UX designer with a wild, intuitive mind and a resume full of firings, too opinionated, too abstract, too unwilling to follow stupid orders, which in our world made him perfect. When he saw my prototype sketches, he said this isn't software, it's an ecosystem, and it needs a soul. So we built one. We worked out of my apartment, pushing aside furniture to make room for whiteboards and server stacks. We borrowed equipment from university labs, scoured open-source tools, lived off microwave burritos and cold brew. Every dollar was stretched, every decision made under pressure. My credit cards were maxed within 2 months. We applied for grants and got denied. We pitched to small-time angel investors who either didn't understand or didn't trust a team of misfits building a security platform in a living room. But we believed in the problem, in each other, in the idea that we could outthink the dinosaurs who still ruled Wall Street. I made one strategic decision early on: I would not use the name Isabel Grant. I registered the project under the pseudonym IG Lin, a hybrid of my initials and Marcus's surname. It wasn't just to protect myself from scrutiny. It was to force the work to stand on its own. No family name, no inherited clout, just code grit and vision. The early days were chaos and glory. We broke things constantly. We fought over architecture and protocol philosophy. We pulled 20-hour sprints followed by nap piles on the couch. But slowly, something real began to emerge. A system that could analyze billions of financial transactions in milliseconds, detect anomalies, and evolve in response. We trained the AI on synthetic fraud patterns, built test environments that mimicked real-world infrastructure, stress tested it until servers fried. It didn't just work, it learned. I still remember the night our first pilot test lit up green across the dashboard, every metric aligned, no latency errors, 0 false positives. Maria screamed. Devon cried. Marcus just whispered, "Holy shit, we built this." And me, I didn't say anything. I just stared at the screen, heart pounding, and thought, this is it. This is the moment I stop hiding. But I didn't tell my family. Not yet. They still thought I was licking my wounds, figuring out my next move, maybe finally ready to come home. Let them believe it. I wasn't ready for their approval or their scrutiny, not until I had something undeniable. The thing about revelations is that they don't always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes they come at 3 a.m. in sweatpants surrounded by wires and empty takeout containers, but they hit just as hard. And if you're paying attention, you realize you're no longer trying to escape gravity. You're learning to defy it. And when they finally appear, they don't just make headlines. They rewrite them. That was the beauty and the paradox of what we were building power without recognition. In a world obsessed with visibility, we had chosen to grow like roots underground, quiet, far-reaching, and impossible to uproot once established. For every fintech startup screaming for attention with glossy pitch decks and hype-fueled LinkedIn posts, we were doing the opposite. While they chased valuation through visibility, we chased value through silence. There was something liberating in that anonymity. I didn't have to perform for investors. I didn't have to endure panels or write medium think pieces to justify our existence. We had one KPI protect better than anyone else. And we did. Word got around, not through TechCrunch or Fortune yet, but through private Slack groups for bank CTOs, through encrypted threads on Signal, through quiet referrals passed from one CISO to another, like insider tips in a crisis. Clients began contacting us through our website's bare-bones contact form, asking things like, "Are you the ones who fixed Holston Bank's breach? Or is it true your AI adapts without rule-based training?" My favourite message came from an anonymous corporate email that simply read, "I heard you don't talk much. I like that. Can we book a demo?" That email led to our first international contract. By year 2, we had a war room. Not a real one, but a room with 3 walls covered in live data streams, threat maps, and what Devon liked to call nerd art, real-time displays of system behaviour that looked more like constellations than code. I used to stand in that room alone sometimes late at night, watching the patterns flicker and shift like neurons firing. Those lights represented trust transactions, payrolls, pensions, mortgage approvals, all moving through our system, protected by something we had built from ramen and rage. It wasn't just clients who noticed. A few curious VCs began sniffing around, trying to uncover who was behind the curtain. They sent emails asking to speak to the CEO. "We've been watching your tech footprint. It's impressive. We'd love to know who you are." I ignored most of them, until one didn't go away. Garrett Wright. His message was short, unassuming. "I don't invest in people who seek attention. I invest in people who can't be ignored." "I think you're the latter. If I'm wrong, I'll delete your number." Attached was a calendar link and a line that said, "No pitch deck. Just show me what you've built." He was the first investor I agreed to meet. We booked a small private room at a co-working space. Marcus ran the demo. Maria walked through the data integrity model. I said almost nothing until the end. Garrett sat through it all with his arms folded stone-faced. Then, finally, he leaned back and said, "You're not pretending to be the future. You're building like the past doesn't deserve to survive." I respect that. He wired $3 million 2 days later. That round funded our expansion. We hired more engineers, moved to a larger office, began formalizing our client services and compliance teams. But still, no press, no names. I wasn't ready to be public. Not yet. The empire was still fragile, still forming. I kept my family entirely in the dark. Every dinner invitation I declined, every birthday call I kept short, every message from my mother asking, "How's the job hunt?" was a test of restraint. I told them I was consulting, doing freelance, exploring, healing. The lie became routine. Not because I was ashamed, but because I knew the moment they knew they would try to reframe it, reclaim it. and I needed to be sure I had built something they couldn't bend. There were close calls. A family friend once emailed me an article referencing our technology anonymously deployed at a major credit union. My mother forwarded it and wrote, "Is this one of the projects you're working on?" "Fascinating stuff," I replied vaguely. "Looks cool. I'll check it out." She didn't push further. Even Jenkins, the family's long-serving butler, texted me once. Heard something curious about a certain algorithm. "I'll keep it to myself. Hope you're eating well." I smiled at my phone for the first time in days. He always knew more than he let on. And so, Safelink continued to grow invisible and undeniable. We were still not a household name, but among the people who mattered, the architects of digital finance, the ones who knew where the world was really going, we were becoming the gold standard. The last line of defense. But power in the shadows only lasts so long. The pressure to go public began to mount. Clients wanted to know who was behind the system, protecting their assets. Industry conferences started inviting IG Lin to speak. Awards were offered, interviews requested. And then one day, an editor from Fortune found a trail. A grant application from years ago. An LLC filing. A name. Mine. She called me directly. "I know who you are," she said, "and I want to tell your story. On the cover." I stared at the phone for a long time. This was it. The moment when the invisible empire would step into the light. But before the world knew, there was one place I had to go. Back to the table where they said I was nothing. The Grant estate looked exactly as I remembered it, timeless, polished, untouchable. The gravel crunched beneath the tires of my modest electric car as I pulled through the wrought iron gates, the fountain still arcing water into the air like some Roman deity frozen mid-boast. The hedges were trimmed to mathematical perfection. The windows gleamed. I'd passed this way hundreds of times as a child, but that day felt different. I wasn't coming home. I was coming to confront the narrative. Jenkins met me at the door with his usual graceful neutrality. "Miss Isabel," he said, taking my coat. "The family is gathered in the drawing room, just about to be called in for dinner." He paused ever so slightly, then added under his breath, "It's good to see you again." I nodded grateful and stepped into the room. There they were, my ghosts, polished, perfumed, and perfectly unaware. My father stood near the fireplace with a glass of scotch in hand, laughing at something Uncle Henry had said. My mother hovered near the piano, arranging flowers that didn't need rearranging. Cousin Ellie was holding court, of course, recounting some negotiation triumph in Dubai with all the effortless charm of someone used to applause. And then there was Aunt Caroline seated, regal as ever, eyes sharp and already locked on me. I hadn't been in this room in 2 years, but nothing had changed. The furniture, the lighting, the way the power subtly shifted with each voice, still choreographed like a symphony of self-congratulation. "Isabel," Aunt Caroline called out across the room. "We weren't sure you'd make it." "Still doing what is it now?" "Digital hobbies consulting, was it?" My mother winced slightly but said nothing. My father took a sip of his drink. I smiled. "You could say I've been keeping busy." "Oh, that's wonderful, dear," she said in a tone that meant exactly the opposite. Jenkins appeared at the threshold. "Dinner is served," he announced, and the parade began into the dining room with its gilded sconces and impossible silence. I was assigned the same seat I always had, growing up nestled between Grandmother Victoria and Cousin Ellie as though no time had passed. The china was the same, the silverware, the suffocating sense of expectation. We began with soup and small talk. Promotions Market gains the newest initiative at Grant & Co. I contributed nothing. Not out of fear, but out of design. I was waiting. Uncle Henry launched into a story about restructuring a hedge fund portfolio. Ellie leaned in with a comment about ESG strategy. Someone laughed too loudly. My mother tried to draw me in. Isabel, tell us what you've been working on lately. But before I could answer, Aunt Caroline cut in again. Still chasing startups? She asked, eyebrows raised. Or has our dear Isabel finally decided to settle into something stable? The table paused, not quite silent, but suddenly aware. I took a breath. Before I could respond, Jenkins re-entered the room. Not with dessert, but with a silver tray and on it a single magazine, Fortune, its cover facing down. Pardon the interruption, he said, with the grace of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. This just arrived for Mr. Grant. Per request to deliver financial publications upon arrival. My father barely looked up as he reached for it. Thank you, Jenkins, he murmured, flipping it over mid-sentence. Then he stopped speaking altogether. The room fell completely still. Slowly he turned the magazine around and placed it at the centre of the table. There I was, on the cover, standing in Safelink's headquarters in my black turtleneck arms, folded San Francisco skyline behind me. The headline read, Isabel Grant, the woman, quietly redefining financial security. Silence, not just stillness, but the absence of belief. My mother dropped her spoon. It clattered against the china. Uncle Henry leaned forward, blinking. This must be an error. Ellie's face paled. Safelink, she whispered. Your IG, Lynn. I looked around at their stunned faces, the elegant room that had so often muted me, and felt something release in my chest. Not vindication, not revenge, just clarity. It's real, I said calmly. Safelink is my company. I founded it 3 years ago. We currently protect over $60 billion in active transaction volume. And yes, I am, IG Lin. My father finally spoke, his voice soft but shaken. Why didn't you tell us? I held his gaze. Because you wouldn't have listened. The silence returned heavier this time, filled with all the unsaid things that had built up over years. Expectations, disappointments, assumptions. Aunt Caroline opened her mouth, then closed it again. And just like that, the balance of power in the Grant family shifted. Ellie was the first to speak. Her voice cracked ever so slightly, like porcelain under stress. You sat across from me last Christmas, nodding while I explained our digital restructuring initiative, all the while knowing you had already built the infrastructure we were trying to imagine. She wasn't angry, at least not with venom, just stunned. I nodded slowly. It wasn't the right time. I needed to protect the vision while it was still growing. My father reached for his glass of water, then changed course and clasped his hands together instead. You founded Safelink, he said, the words deliberately measured. The system Citadel adopted last quarter. The same one we just lost a government contract to. Yes, I replied, and others. I built the core algorithms myself. We now service 15 financial institutions and have recently expanded into EU compliance systems. He blinked. And you did all this without our help. No, I said gently. I did it despite your help. The words landed like thunderclaps across the table, not shouted, not accusatory, just the simple, undeniable truth. My mother reached forward slightly, her voice quieter. Isabel, why didn't you tell us? We could have what? I interrupted, not harshly but firmly, tried to steer me back to risk compliance, talk me into a sensible position, offer me capital with caveats and conditions. You never saw me as capable of building something outside the Grant mold. You saw me as confused, as a phase. That's not fair, my father said, but even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Is it? I asked. You told me to grow up and come back when the fantasy was over. You sent recruiters my way for jobs I never applied for. You told me Ellie was doing it right. You never once asked what I wanted, just assumed I'd realize I was wrong eventually. Silence again. Aunt Caroline fidgeted with her bracelet. Ellie stared down at her plate. Then Jenkins cleared his throat. "If I may," he said softly, stepping slightly closer to the table, "Miss Isabel's work has been referenced in several of the newsletters I subscribe to. Quite favourably, I might add. One article noted that Safelink's encryption model outperforms legacy systems by a factor of 4. I recall thinking at the time, that sounds like something Miss Isabel might have envisioned." The room shifted again, this time toward a new centre of gravity. "Thank you, Jenkins," I said, eyes stinging with the smallest hint of gratitude. "That means more than you know." My father looked at me, his voice quieter now. "You're saying you never needed our approval?" "I'm saying," I replied, "that I spent years craving it. Then I realised what I needed more was belief in my own voice. Approval isn't the same as understanding, and understanding isn't the same as support." My mother swallowed hard. I owe you an apology," she whispered. "I think we all do," Ellie added. "We saw what we wanted to see, or what made us feel comfortable." I gave her a small nod. "It's okay. Truly. I didn't build this to prove you wrong. I built it because it was necessary, because the financial world needed to evolve and no one was listening. So I did. And now," my father asked. "Now," I said, steady and clear, "the world is listening. Tomorrow the world sees what I've built. But tonight I needed to come here. Not to brag, not to gloat, but to finally take my seat at this table as who I really am. Not a shadow of your expectations, not a cautionary tale, but a grant in her own right." There was a beat, then another, until finally my grandmother, silent until now, raised her glass. "To Isabel," she said softly, "who dared to write her own chapter in the family story. May the rest of us have the wisdom to read it carefully." And as the glasses clinked, tentative, reverent, a little late, I felt the ghosts begin to retreat. Not banished, but acknowledged. Not vanquished, but outgrown. After the toast conversation didn't so much resume as reshape. What had once been a cacophony of overlapping accolades and power plays softened into scattered questions, subdued nods and silent reckonings. It was as though the gravity of the night had recalibrated the family's collective pulse. I watched my father closely. He had always occupied rooms like a fixed star, immovable, revered, unquestioned. Now, though, he looked like a man confronted with the impossible math of change. He stood quietly and gestured toward his study. "Isabel, could we talk?" The room gave him space without being told. I followed him down the hallway, the echoes of our footsteps softened by Persian rugs and generations of expectation. Once inside, he poured 2 glasses of his favourite single malt and handed me one. "I never imagined I'd be drinking this with you under these circumstances," he said. "Neither did I replied. He didn't sit. He paced. "I've been reading about Safelink," he began. "Since Jenkins mentioned it, I looked it up. Your system is being called the future of transaction security. I saw the Forbes piece and MIT Technology Review." He turned to face me. "Why didn't you tell me you'd built something this monumental?" I sighed, "because when I talked about ideas before, you heard rebellion, not vision. You saw it as a reaction to being different. You didn't see it as leadership." "Maybe I was protecting you," he said. "From risk, from disappointment. Or maybe you were protecting yourself," I said gently. "From the discomfort of a daughter whose ambitions you didn't understand." He flinched, then nodded. "Maybe both." Then, after a long pause, he added, "You're bored. Do they know you're considering expansion into capital lending infrastructure?" I raised an eyebrow. "I haven't said anything publicly yet." "How do you know?" He smiled faintly. "I still have some friends in venture circles. Rumours travel. Isabel, what you're building is bigger than you think. It's not just software. It's a framework, a new standard. I've seen legacy giants get disrupted by less." "That's the idea," I said. but not to destroy, to evolve. He took a sip from his glass, then set it down. You could use a partner, someone who knows regulation, infrastructure, global banking networks. I knew where this was going. I waited. What if Safelink became part of Grant Holdings, he said, not absorbed, partnered, with full creative control maintained, of course. You'd have our resources, our contacts, our reach, and we could help scale it faster, much faster. There it was, the offer. I had been waiting for it since the moment I revealed myself. I met his gaze steadily. I appreciate that, I said slowly. Truly. And I understand it comes from a place of respect now, not correction. It does, he said quickly. This isn't about control, it's about legacy, about building something that lasts beyond both of us. Then, let me be clear, I said. This wasn't built to be absorbed. It was built to be free. To show people, especially those like me, that innovation doesn't have to come with strings. That freedom is the seed of vision. But you'll face pressures, Isabel. Competition, regulation, media scrutiny. A larger partner could buffer you from all that. Or dilute what makes Safelink work, I said. We're lean, fast, unorthodox. That's why we've succeeded. We think differently because we were built differently. You've said it yourself for years, Grant Holdings isn't built for agility. You're built for stability. He considered this, hands in his pockets, eyes now searching mine with something approaching admiration. So what happens now, he asked. We stay separate, I said, but aligned in purpose. Safelink will continue to protect institutions like yours, not as a subsidiary, but as a partner. That is, if you're still interested. Of course I am, he said. That's the irony, isn't it? You had to step away from the Grant name to make it strong again, just not in the way we expected. I smiled. Not in the way you expected, but maybe exactly in the way we needed. He offered his hand. I took it. It wasn't a deal. It was a beginning. Later that night, back in the drawing room, Aunt Caroline pulled me aside. Your grandmother says you're hosting a West Coast dinner this fall, she said, attempting a casual tone. Perhaps the board could attend. It might be good to understand this new direction from the inside. You're welcome to come, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. But not to evaluate, just to listen. She pressed her lips together, then nodded. Ellie approached as Caroline walked away. You meant what you said, didn't you? She asked, about building it free, every word. Then teach me, she said. I've spent years learning how to fit the system. I want to know how to reimagine it. That was the moment I'd secretly hoped for all along. Not applause, not validation, but curiosity. A genuine willingness to unlearn. Come to San Francisco, I told her. Sit with my team, see how we move, and then we'll talk. Deal, she said. One condition, though. What's that, I asked. You let me call you Mum once, just so Dad hears it. I laughed, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and exhausted and victorious. Only once, I said. Make it count. Ellie arrived in San Francisco 2 weeks later, wheeling a sleek black suitcase behind her and wearing the cautious expression of someone stepping into unfamiliar territory. She didn't bring a driver or an assistant or even a wardrobe that screamed Wall Street, just herself, a notebook, and eyes that finally looked curious rather than performative. Is this really it? She asked as we stepped into the Safelink building, glass steel and sun-drenched minimalism. This is it, I said. No marble columns, no family crest, just brains and bandwidth. The lobby buzzed with quiet intensity, teams huddled at standing desks, diagrams scrawled across massive glass walls, data flowing across display panels like heartbeat monitors. She watched a cluster of engineers arguing passionately over an anomaly detection sequence, their jargon rapid and layered. And they all know who you are, she asked. Here, yes. Everywhere else, not always. That's wild, she said. I've spent my entire career trying to make sure everyone knew who I was before I opened my mouth. I did the opposite, I said. Turns out, ideas speak louder when they're not attached to expectation. I gave her the tour personally, introduced her to Marcus, who barely glanced up from his laptop but grunted in approval. Maria, who asked 3 blunt technical questions in under a minute. Devon, who waved a stylus in the air and said, "Don't let her fool you. She's scarier than all of us." By the end of the day, Ellie had filled 3 pages of notes and was uncharacteristically quiet. We sat in the cafeteria, just a corner of open space with beanbags cold brew on tap and someone playing soft lo-fi beats from their desk. So she finally said, "How do you get used to not knowing where the ceiling is?" "You don't," I said. "You just stop asking permission to look up." That night I found her still at her borrowed desk reading Safelink's internal white paper on dynamic consensus modelling. She looked up. "You know, I used to think you were the cautionary tale, the one who walked away. Now I'm realising maybe you were the prototype." I smiled. "Maybe we're all both." A week later, my mother came to visit. She didn't come alone, brought fresh-baked scones, probably as an emotional shield. But she came. She stood in the middle of our operations floor, surrounded by screens she didn't understand, and for the first time in my life didn't try to offer advice. She just said, "You built this?" "Yes, and it's beautiful." "Thank you." She nodded slowly, then asked, "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if you'd stayed on the original path?" "Every now and then," I said, but only to remind myself why I left it. We sat in silence for a moment. "Your father's been reading everything he can about your systems," she said. "He even tried explaining neural networks to me last night." "Poorly," I laughed. I'd pay money to hear that. "He's trying," she said. "We both are. We may be late to your story, but we're still reading." It was the most honest thing she'd said to me in years. As summer faded into fall, Grant family members came in trickles, sometimes out of obligation, sometimes curiosity. Caroline, of course, didn't ask for a tour. She requested a meeting with my CFO. But she asked questions that mattered, and for once didn't interrupt the answers. My father returned a month later this time, with no agenda. He walked through the engineering wing, shook hands, asked Marcus about quantum encryption, like a man trying to speak a second language he never thought he'd need. And me, I let it happen. I didn't fight to prove anything. I didn't chase their understanding. I just kept building. Safelink continued to grow. We expanded into Asia Pacific, signed partnerships with NGOs to protect financial data in vulnerable regions. We hired former regulators, school dropouts, and machine learning specialists who had once been laughed out of corporate interviews. And through it all, the grants stayed close, but not too close. Not owners, not overlords, witnesses, supporters. In time, they stopped calling what I built a deviation. They started calling it evolution. Ellie stayed on, took a leave from Grant & Co. to join our strategy team. At first, she was overwhelmed. Then she was invaluable. We didn't always agree, but we always moved. Together. One evening, as we prepared for a global summit in Berlin, she handed me a binder with Safelink's Year 3 growth report. "We should talk next week," she said. "I think it's time we start thinking beyond finance." "We already are," I replied. "I just haven't told you yet." "You're impossible," she said. "Your family," I replied, and we both laughed, not from irony or tension, but from the joy of finally meeting in the middle. Coexistence isn't compromise. It's choosing to stand on different foundations while reaching toward the same horizon. For the first time in my life, I wasn't standing in rebellion or retreat. I was standing with clarity, with roots in one world and vision in another. And the view was spectacular. Berlin was colder than I remembered. The wind off the spree carried the sharp bite of autumn cutting through layers of silk and strategy. I stood backstage at the World Innovation and Ethics Forum, watching the final speaker before me, a celebrated economist from Geneva, wrap up her segment on AI and decentralization. The crowd was impressive. Leaders from finance policy, technology, and philanthropy had gathered here to discuss the future, though many of them still wore the past, like tailored suits. My name had been on the lineup for months, listed simply as I.G. Lin, founder, Safelink Systems. No mention of grant, no legacy, just what I'd built. And yet, when I peeked out through the curtain, I saw them. My father sitting front row in a charcoal suit, back straight expression, unreadable. My mother was beside him, hands clasped delicately in her lap. Ellie 3 rows behind, flanked by Maria and Devon, my family both chosen and inherited. It wasn't lost on me that this would be the first time my parents heard my story from my own mouth uninterrupted on a stage where their silence couldn't reshape the narrative. A stage they hadn't built, a voice they hadn't claimed. The host introduced me. Applause rose not thunderous, but respectful, curious. I walked out slowly, deliberately toward the lectern. My slides were minimalist, just words and images that anchored my truth. I didn't start with credentials or metrics. I started with a table. When I was 13, I said I learned that the loudest voices in the room often belonged to the most traditional ideas. I also learned how to stay quiet, how to fold innovation into silence, how to disappear in plain sight, not because I lacked ideas, but because I lacked permission. The room listened, leaned in. I come from a family where power was inherited, not questioned, where success was measured in positions, held, not problems solved. I spent years trying to become small enough to fit that mold. And when I couldn't, I left the mold behind. I told them about Safelink, not just the tech, but the purpose. We'd built a system that didn't just predict fraud, but adapted to its language. How we'd protected microloans in rural India and shielded pension networks in South America. How we operated on trust, not clout. We didn't ask for attention, I said. We asked for accountability. We didn't raise our hands. We raised the standard. I didn't pace. I didn't perform. I stood still, let the silence breathe, let the truth speak. Then I turned to the slide that showed nothing but a white table surrounded by translucent chairs. A few months ago, I said I sat at a table where I was once told I was nothing. That table hasn't changed, but I have. And maybe that's the point. Innovation doesn't always come from new furniture. Sometimes it comes from refusing to be shaped by the old. The applause started softly, then swelled. I nodded, stepped back, let the curtain fall. Backstage, I exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. I didn't look for my father. I didn't need to. I knew he'd heard it. Later that evening, as the city lights flickered over the river and the reception wound down, he approached. No entourage, no agenda. Just a glass of water in one hand and a folded program in the other. You didn't just speak, he said. You anchored. That was the goal, I said. He nodded. You know, I used to think power was about control, but maybe it's just about clarity, about giving people something solid to stand on. That's what Safelink is, I said. That's what I've become. My mother joined us, her eyes misty. We're proud of you, she said, not just for what you've built, but for who you've become building it. I didn't cry. I didn't deflect. I just said, thank you, and meant it. Ellie found me later, holding a glass of champagne and a phone buzzing with press alerts. So she grinned. Mom, shall we expand to healthcare fraud detection next? Let's make the world safe one blind spot at a time, I said, and make it ours. As the night deepened and laughter filled the room, I stepped out onto the balcony, the city stretching wide beneath me. I thought of that dinner years ago, the way Aunt Caroline's words had sliced through my spirit, the way I'd buried my brilliance just to survive. And then I thought of now, of the company, of the people, of the path that had never been a straight line but a spiral, not a return to where I began, but a rise to something higher. Full circle isn't coming back. It's arriving where you belong, finally whole, finally seen, finally free. And maybe you're listening to this right now, not from a penthouse boardroom or legacy estate, but from your dorm room, your shared apartment, or even your parents' basement. Maybe you've been told you're not enough, that your dreams are too big, too different, too unrealistic. If that's you, I want you to know something. You are not a failure. You are a spark waiting for the right wind. And the silence you're sitting in right now, it's not rejection, it's gestation. Your time will come. And when it does, you won't need to shout. You'll only need to stand still and let your work speak. If this story reminded you of your own path, subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. Stories about being underestimated and rising anyway. Because somewhere out there, someone else needs to hear it too. And maybe that someone is you.